Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember, context is everything media network founder and CEO John Michael is reading a textbook, cover to cover. Today, we're here starting chapter 19. Chapter 19, the French Revolution and Napoleon. Why don't we just get right into it here? This chapter spans the years 1789 to 1815. And it is right in the wake of the American Revolution, which inspired this French Revolution. And we'll hear about that shortly. Chapter 19, Section 1, page 468 of 1007. Every page has been read in this channel. Join, if you like. Subscribe. This book is outdated, by the way. Copyright 2001. Section 1. On the eve of revolution. Setting the scene. On April 28th, 1789, unrest exploded as a Paris wallpaper factory. A rumor had spread that the factory owner was planning to cut wages even though bread prices were soaring. Enraged workers vandalized the owner's home. Later, they stopped some nobles returning from an afternoon at the racetrack. They forced the nobles to shout, "Long live the Third Estate!" The common people. The Third Estate are the common people. They forced nobles to scream, "Long live the Third Estate!" Riots like these did not worry most nobles. They knew that France faced a severe economic crisis, but thought that financial reforms would ease the problem. Then, rioters would be hanged as they deserved. The nobles were wrong. The crisis went deeper than government finances. Reform would not be enough. In July of 1789, the hungry, unemployed, and poorly paid people of Paris had taken up arms. Their actions would even push events further and faster than anyone could have foreseen. The old regime. In 1789, France, like the rest of Europe, still clung to an outdated social system that had emerged in the Middle Ages. Under the Ancien Regime, or Old Order, everyone in France belonged to one of these three classes. The First Estate, made up of the clergy, the Second Estate, made up of the nobility, and the Third Estate, the vast majority of the population. The clergy. Let's talk a little bit about the clergy and the First Estate. In the Middle Ages, the Church had exerted great influence throughout Christian Europe. In 1789, the French clergy still enjoyed enormous wealth and privilege. The Church owned about 10% of the land, collected tithes, and paid no direct taxes to the state. High Church leaders, such as bishops and abbots, were usually nobles who lived very well. Parish priests, however, often came from humble origins and might be as poor as their peasant congregations. The First Estate did provide some social services. Nuns and monks and priests ran schools, hospitals, and orphanages. But during the Enlightenment, philosophers targeted the Church for reform. They criticized the idleness of some clergy, church interference in politics, and its intolerance of dissent. In response, many clergy condemned the Enlightenment for undermining religion and moral order. The nobles, the Second Estate. The Second Estate was the titled the nobility of French society. In the Middle Ages, noble knights had defended the land. In the 1600s, Richelieu and Louis XIV had crushed the nobles' military power, but given Richelieu and Louis XIV had crushed the nobles' military power. In the 1600s, Richelieu and Louis XIV had crushed nobles' military power, but not given them other rights. Under strict royal control, those rights included top jobs in government, the army, the courts, and the church. At Versailles, ambitious nobles competed for royal appointments, while idle courtiers enjoyed endless entertainments. Courtiers, I believe that those are people of the court. So they're like kind of related to the nobles, the people that are. I don't really know what courtier means, but I know it's important, and I know it has something to do with like the king and their court. And the courtiers are the people in the court of the king. Versailles being the place. Giant. King palace. Beautiful. Still to this day. Many nobles, however, lived far from the center of power. Though they owned land, they had little money income. As a result, they felt the pinch of trying to maintain their status in a period of rising prices. Many nobles hated absolutism and resented the royal bureaucracy that employed middle-class men in positions that once had been reserved for the aristocracy. They feared losing their traditional privileges, especially their freedom from paying taxes. The Third Estate. In 1789, the Third Estate numbered about 27 million people, or 98% of the population. It was a diverse group. At the top sat the bourgeoisie, or middle class. The bourgeoisie included prosperous bankers, merchants, and manufacturers. It also included the officials who staffed the royal bureaucracy, as well as lawyers, doctors, journalists, professors, and skilled artisans. The bulk of the Third Estate, 9 out of 10 people in France, were rural peasants. Some were prosperous landowners who hired laborers to work for them. Others were tenant farmers or day laborers. The poorest members of the Third Estate were urban workers. They included apprentices, journeymen, and others who worked in industries such as printing and cloth making. Many women and men earned meager living as servants, stable hands, porters, construction workers, or street sellers, of everything from food to pots and pans. A large number of the urban poor were unemployed. To survive, some turned to begging or crime. Discontent. This is discontent in the old regime. From rich to poor, members of the Third Estate resented the privileges enjoyed by their social betters. Wealthy bourgeoisie families could buy political office and even titles, but the best jobs were still reserved for nobles. Urban workers earned miserable wages. Even the smallest rise in price of bread, their main food, brought the threat of greater hunger or even starvation. Peasants were burdened by taxes on everything from the land to soap to salt. Though they were technically free, many owed fees and services that dated back to medieval times, such as the corvée, which was an unpaid labor to repair roads and bridges. Weird. Peasants were also incensed when nobles, hurt by rising prices, tried to reimpose old manor dues. Also, only nobles had the right to hunt wild game. Peasants were even forbidden to kill rabbits that ate their crops. How bizarre. What strange laws. In towns and cities, Enlightenment ideas led people to question the inequalities of the old regime. why people demanded should the first two estates have such great privileges at the expense of the majority? It did not meet the test of reason. Throughout France, the third estate called for the privileged class to pay their share. Economic troubles. New heading. Thank you for joining me in this reading. I hope you subscribe and I hope you enjoy. Economic troubles. Well, I hope you don't, you know what I mean. I hope you enjoy the broadcast, not the economic troubles. Economic woes added to the social unrest and heightened tensions. One of the causes of the decline was the mushrooming financial crisis that was due in part to years of deficit spending. That is, a government spending more money than it takes in. The burden of debt. Louis XIV had left France deeply in debt. Wars like the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution strained the treasury even further. Costs generally had risen in the 1700s, and the lavish court soaked up millions. To bridge the gap between income and expenses, the government borrowed more and more money. By 1789, half of its tax income was just to pay interest on its enormous debt. To solve the financial crisis, the government would have to increase taxes, reduce spending, or both. However, the nobles and clergy fiercely resisted any attempt to end their exemptions from taxes. Poor harvests. Other economic troubles added to the financial crisis. A general economic decline had begun in 1770s. Then, in the late 1780s, bad harvests sent food prices soaring and brought hunger to poorer peasants and city dwellers. Hard times and lack of food inflamed these people. In towns, people rioted, demanding bread. In the countryside, peasants began to attack manor houses of the nobles. Arthur Young, an English visitor to France, witnessed the violence. Everything conspires to render the peasants' period in France critical. The lack of bread is terrible. Accounts arrive every moment from the provinces of riots and disturbances, and calling in the military to preserve the peace of the markets. Arthur Young travels in France during the years 1787 to 1789. Failure of reform. The heirs of Louis XIV were not the right men to solve economic crises that afflicted France. Louis XV, who ruled from 1715 to 1774, that's a heck of a run, pursued pleasure before serious business and ran up more debts. His grandson, Louis XVI, yikes, was well-meaning but weak and indecisive. He wisely chose Jacques Necker, a financial wizard, as an advisor. Necker urged the king to reduce extravagant court spending, reform government, and abolish burdensome tariff on internal trade. When Necker proposed taxing the first and second estates, however, the nobles and high clergy forced the king to dismiss the would-be reformer. As the crisis deepened, the pressure from the reform mounted. Finally, wealthy and powerful classes demanded that the king summon the Estates General. That's what the Estates General is. Before making any changes. French kings had not called the Estates General for 175 years, fearing the nobles would use it to recover their feudal powers that they had lost under the absolute rule. To reform-minded nobles, the Estates General seemed to offer a chance to carry out changes, like those that had come with the Glorious Revolution in England. They hoped that they could bring the absolute monarch under the control of nobles and guarantee their own privileges. Louis XVI calls the Estate General. Louis XVI calls the Estates General. This is a new heading. In 1788, as 1788 came to a close, France tottered on the verge of bankruptcy. Bread riots were spreading, and nobles fearful of taxes, were denouncing royal tyranny. A baffled Louis XVI finally summoned the Estates General to meet at Versailles the following year. The Cahiers. I don't know what that is. Cahiers. Cahiers. In preparation, Louis had all three estates prepare cahiers, or notebooks, listing their grievances. The many cahiers called for reforms such as fairer taxes, freedom of the press, or regular meetings of the Estates General. In one town, shoemakers denounced regulations that made leather so expensive they could not afford to make shoes. Some peasants demanded the right to kill animals that were destroying their crops. Servant girls in towns of Toulouse, Toulouse, demanded the right to leave service when they wanted, and that after a girl has served her master for many years, she receives some reward for her services. The cahiers testified to boiling class resentments. One called tax collectors bloodsuckers of the nation who drink the tears of the unfortunate from the goblets of gold. Another one of the cahiers condemned courts of the nobles as vampires pumping the last drop of blood from the people. Others complained that 2 million must live, or rather, 20 million must live on half of the wealth of France, while the clergy devour the other half. And the clergy make up 1%, by the way. The tennis court oath. Delegates of the Estates General from the Third Estate were elected, though only propertied men could vote. Thus, they were mostly lawyers, middle-class officials, and writers. They were familiar with writing of Voltaire, Rousseau, and the philosophers. They went to Versailles not only to solve the financial crisis, but also to insist on reform. The Estates General convened in May 1789. From the start, the delegates were deadlocked over the issue of voting. Traditionally, each estate had met and voted separately. Each group had one vote. Under this system, the first and second estates always outvoted the third estate 2-1. This time, the Third Estate wanted all three estates to meet in a single body, with voters counted by head. After weeks of stalemate, delegates of the Third Estate took a daring step, claiming to represent the people of France. They declared themselves to be the National Assembly. They then invited delegates from other estates to help them write a constitution, a document that described the basic rules and laws of government. A few days later, the National Assembly found its meeting hall locked and guarded. Fearing that the king planned to dismiss them, the delegates moved to nearby indoor tennis court. Weird. As curious spectators looked on, the delegates took their familiar tennis court oath. Their famous tennis court oath. They swore never to separate and to meet wherever the circumstances might require until we have established a sound and just constitution. When reform-minded clergy and nobles joined the assembly, Louis XVI grudgingly accepted it. But royal troops gathered around Paris, and rumors spread that the king planned to dissolve the assembly. Suspicion and rumors continued to poison the atmosphere as the crisis deepened into early July. The king, who had brought back Necker, the money guy, the financial wizard, to deal with the financial crisis, again dismissed by popular minister. The king, who brought back Necker to deal with financial crisis, again dismissed the popular minister. Food shortages were also getting worse because of the disastrous harvest of 1788. Storming the Bastille, and this is the last heading of the section. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that you enjoy, I hope that you like, and I hope that you subscribe. Thank you. Storming the Bastille. In July 14th, 1789, Paris seized the spotlight from the National Assembly meeting in Versailles. The streets buzzed with reforms. The streets buzzed with rumors that royal troops were going to occupy the capital. More than 800 Parisians assembled outside of the Bastille, a grim medieval fortress used as a prison for political and other prisoners. The crowd was demanding weapons and gunpowder, believed to be stored within. The commander of the Bastille refused to open the gates and opened fire on the crowd. In the battle that followed, many people were killed. Finally, the enraged mob broke through the defenses. They killed the commander and 5 guards and released a handful of prisoners, but found no weapons. When told of the attacks, Louis XVI asked, "Is it a revolt?" "No, sire," replied a noble. "It is a revolution." The storming of the Bastille quickly became a symbol of French Revolution. Supporters saw it as a blow to tyranny, a step towards freedom. Today, the French still celebrate July 14th as Bastille Day, the French national holiday. Thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoy, and I hope they have a wonderful day. Goodbye.